everyone, and welcome to episode 264 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. We've all been there. You're sitting in class or in a movie theater, and everyone around you seems completely enraptured by what they're hearing, as if it's the best thing since sliced bread. But you can't help thinking to yourself, is it just me, or is this actually pretty bad? When it comes to classics of literature like the Canterbury Tales, it can feel like there's a lot of pressure to nod along with the crowd and say that some authors are just brilliant, full stop. But sometimes somebody has to stand up and say that the emperor has no clothes, because sometimes even great literature isn't so great. This week, I spoke with Dr. Tison Pugh about the good, the bad, and the ugly in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Tison is Pegasus Professor of English at the University of Central Florida and the author of over 24 books, including On the Queerness of Early English Drama, Sex in the Subjunctive, and Chaucer's Anti-Eroticisms and the Queer Middle Ages. His new book is Bad Chaucer, the great poet's greatest mistakes in the Canterbury Tales. Our conversation on Chaucer at his cringiest is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Tison, for joining me to talk about Bad Chaucer. I'm just so excited to meet you, for one, and I absolutely love this book. So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so you wrote a book called Bad Chaucer. This is like throwing a grenade into medieval studies. Why did you decide to write this book?
It's always interesting how ideas for books germinate. And so this one, I think, came about from a couple of different vectors or something, to use an unnecessary physics analogy. I mean, just reading the Canterbury Tales over and over and over, as a teacher of the Canterbury Tales does, you do keep seeing that there are some very rough spots in a masterpiece. And so I thought it was very humanizing to kind of think about Chaucer as one of the greatest artists of his time and of all time, but also as someone who probably struggled with his art. And I think sometimes he lost. And so it just seemed a good way to think a new approach on Chaucer, where he is rightly venerated for his achievements in so many ways, but also as someone who has many, many rough patches in his work. And so much scholarship, what I'm doing in this work is not what is typically seen as scholarship, I think. And that was part of the thrill of it and the fun of it, too, to take a different approach, not trying to put Chaucer in his historical perspective or think about this from a deeply critical angle, but just kind of to loosen up the scholarly conversation a bit and say, what's bad about the Knight's Tale? What's bad about the Miller's Tale? And so I set myself the challenge to find at least one bad thing for each of the tales.
I love that. And this is the book I didn't realize I needed, because as I was saying to Usha, we were just talking about, I had a conversation with Usha not too long ago, and I was saying to her, I was the person at the table who was like, I like medieval studies because of Disney. And I was also always the person at the table who was like, I don't really love the Canterbury Tales. And the reason for it is I find it hugely unsettling. And a lot of the reasons for that are ones that you pull out in the book. So I was so validated to read this book.
Oh, thank you. Good. Good.
Yeah, because you could see that Chaucer has immense talent, and I like his other stuff better, but there's a lot that's unsettling in this work. So as much as we're not settling this on a person, can you just give us a background? Chaucer is who and when is he writing?
Sure. So Chaucer is often referred to as the father of English literature, a very patriarchal term, but one that perhaps is merited due to the fact that he wrote the masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, as well as some others, including Troilus and Cressida in the 14th century. And he is credited with bringing the English language and English literature to a higher level than it's been before. I think, of course, people would debate that, but Italy was seen as the apex of Western European culture at the time. And Chaucer took a trip to Italy as part of his workings for the royal court, and there came across the works of Petrarch and Dante and Boccaccio. And we can definitely see very strong influences of each of those writers on him. But my favorite piece of influence is it really seems that Boccaccio set a challenge unintentionally for Chaucer because in the Decameron, Boccaccio was not going to, but did write 100 tales. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was supposed to have 120 as originally envisioned. And so you could really see him kind of laying down a gauntlet for no, English literature can be great. Of course, he died long before completing them, but the aspiration was there. We need to give him credit for the aspiration. So the Canterbury Tales that we do have are a motley collection, and they range in tone and scope. And I would add talent, right? That some of them he really shines through, and others do not set him off to such a great light.
It's true, though. It's true. So before we get into the tales themselves, as you're wrestling with this as a piece of art, as a work, how much of it do you think the badness can we ascribe to the fact that it is unfinished?
Right.
I'm sure you had to wrestle with this question when you were looking at it. So how much do you ascribe to this being a work in progress?
Not a lot, actually. I deal with that the most with the Cook's Tale. And the Cook's Tale for Chaucerians is this vexing conundrum of is it finished, is it not finished? It appears unfinished. But for the most part, the tales that are written are completed themselves. And so there's some debates about whether this one might have gone on longer or such and forth like that. But for the most part, the tales are complete. And so we can look at them individually and think about what they're doing, how they're playing with different genres, how Chaucer is using his sources and revamping classical tales and other legends that he knows. So I didn't let the incompleteness of it serve as an out for Chaucer. Sorry, Chaucer. There's enough there for me to get my hooks into you.
Right. And something we were just talking about before we turned the recording on was how much does his biography matter when we're looking at the art? How much does his biography matter? Because some people will pin their arguments about the Canterbury Tales on a biographical detail of the very few
Right.
that we have. How much does biography count when we're looking at something like this?
Well, that was kind of another angle for this project. It just always kind of annoys and astounds me when scholars will write, and it's often in passing, it's often not like part of a major argument, but that, Chaucer must have had a great personality and been, so much fun to be around, such a great sense of humor, or a bit more seriously, that Chaucer must have been a feminist because he wrote one of the great feminist characters of all time in The Wife of Bath. But misogynists can write compelling characters, compelling female characters. And so it just was always kind of surprising to me that scholars who I would think would know better were drawing kind of personal conclusions about Chaucer's personality based on the Canterbury Tales. But there are no end of examples of great authors who were horrible people, just horrible people. And so part of the fun of the title for me of Bad Chaucer is I hope just pointing out but there's that possibility too, right? That we don't know enough to say that he was a good or a bad person. I think we do know enough to say that the Canterbury Tales is a great work of literature. But again, that was part of the perverse pleasure of this book for me of thinking about, yes, it is so great, but there are some weird parts and bad parts and, other parts that people just want to gloss over instead of grappling with. I mean, for example, the Prioress's Tale is, I'm sorry, a blatantly anti-Semitic text. And so many Chaucerian scholars will bend over backwards to say, oh, no, it's in the mouth of the prioress, so, we can't count this. And I can't speak, right? I can't then say that I can speak to Chaucer's belief on anti-Semitism, but I can say the tale is emphatically anti-Semitic, and I think that needs to be said and not edged around or hedged around by scholarly evasions.
I was thinking a lot about another amazing writer in the form of William Shakespeare and how people will sometimes ascribe biographical
Right.
details to his works and stuff like that. And I'm wondering how, in some ways, he gets off a little easier than Chaucer does. And I'm wondering if maybe this is the fact that Chaucer puts himself in the tale. So when
Right.
you have the prioress telling this totally anti-Semitic tale, and it is completely, I'm totally on board with that. he doesn't speak up. The character of Chaucer doesn't say a word. And so that seems very telling to me, like
Right,
not that we can say one to one that the narrator is,
right.
Chaucer, but it's pretty obvious that he's not saying a word.
Yes, no, and it seems that all the pilgrims are responding very soberly, I believe the word is, right? That they're
Mhm.
responding to the tale as it's envisioned, having a kind of prayerful effect on them. And
Mhm.
so I've heard that scene of the tale being read completely opposite, and I do not buy the completely opposite reading, right? I think that the medieval pilgrims are responding in a devout manner to a display of anti-Semitism. And so to see that and not to call it what it seems so blatantly to me it is deeply problematic. I think, as much as scholars will try to set ourselves apart as, oh, we are these dispassionate observers, we're not, right? Why did we dedicate our lives to reading the Canterbury Tales? It's because it's a very fun collection of stories. And I think it becomes a little bit disturbing for then people to think, okay, I love these stories, but what about the person who wrote them? It's almost, that Chaucer becomes a metonymy or a synecdoche. I can never remember the difference for the Canterbury Tales themselves. And so to say I love Chaucer is the same as to say I love the Canterbury Tales when it's really not. And I think we need to be careful about how those two completely distinct entities, or maybe not even completely, but distinct enough entities, can problematically collapse into each other.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that people have to wrestle with, especially when a lot of the people writing on Chaucer are also teaching in the classroom. Then
Right.
you have students saying, well, why do you like this? Because it's so anti-Semitic. Like, how can we like this at all? I think
Hmm.
that that probably is the genesis of a lot of this working with the text and try and make it maybe a little bit more friendly.
Hmm. Yeah, but our students are smart. I mean, they can handle complexity. I mean, I don't want to harp on the Prioress's tale to let it take up too much of the conversation, but I've talked in office hours with some of my Jewish students about this text, and they don't want it to be skipped over, the ones I've talked to, right? And they understand the context. And the same with many of my female students who are, rightly upset about rape and rape culture but can read the Canterbury Tales, can enjoy them, I hope, but also understand historical context versus today's context and how things have changed and sadly how things have not have changed. But we can't sanitize the past for our students. And I think that would be unhelpful anyway. That we need to, share with them the complexity of the text of the historical record, but not show ourselves to be chained for it. And
Mhm.
so again, I think just, my title, Bad Chaucer, kind of points that out. He's a bad person in the sense that he's like all people. All people do good things and all people do bad things. So we need to put his goodness and his badness both within the context of 14th century England, but also in our context of how we read and teach and keep him alive today. I think we have to confront the ethics of keeping him alive today. For me, I think it is an ethical thing to do to continue teaching him, but I'm mindful about the way I do it.
So, as you're bringing this up, when you teach something like the Prioress's Tale, how do you situate it? Are you situating it in the sense of this is the type of tale that was told at this time and this is how it's different? How are you doing it when you're coming up with this tale in particular?
Right. Well, I mean, for all the tales, I always, try to set them at least within their context of genre because medieval genres are so different from modern genres. And so I've always found that a great way of helping students understand what to expect. So just that they understand to read The Knight's Tale as a romance. Sadly, we don't have Fabliaux today anymore as a genre per se. And so to introduce the Miller's Tale and the Reeve's Tale along those lines. And so the Prioress's Tale, as you mentioned specifically, right, I want to put it into context of the anti-Semitic literature of the Western Middle Ages. And so they see it's not an outlier. How is it participating in various traditions? What is Chaucer doing differently with it? And a lot of scholarship has shown that he exaggerated his sources, made them more troubling than they were to begin with. And again, I don't think we should sidestep that in our lectures about it.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we picked this one up as maybe the first tale to talk about because it is something that you really do have to wrestle with when you're coming
Right.
across it, even though it is very typical in a lot of ways for medieval literature to come across
Mhm.
a miracle story that involves Jewish people who are persecuting, especially a child is situated in a very specific medieval context. Yeah, it is tricky when you're trying to love Chaucer as a guy. It's hard to come across something like that.
It is. And, and just as a pedagogical strategy, I think showing when the teacher shows enthusiasm for a text or an author, right? I think that can be very effective in the classroom, right? That, okay, I might be this weird person who's dedicated my life to the Middle Ages, but at least I'm enthusiastic about it, right? I'm trying to share my enthusiasm with you. And so it's a very powerful technique, but I think we have to combine our enthusiasm for what we're teaching with a realization of its limits too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so when you were starting with this project, was there a particular tale that you were just like, I just need to talk about this because I think this is bad and I just need to share? Was there one that
Well,
sort of touched it off?
I can't remember if one touched it off. It was more just, laying up at night thinking about, okay, I finished this book, so now I need another one. And
Hmm.
what would be my next idea? It might have been The Knight's Tale because I've always been fascinated by the catalog of trees, which I think is one of just the worst pieces of writing I've ever seen in my life. And it's bad writing that makes sense because Chaucer's Knight's Tale, it's, a classical epic combined with a chivalric romance. So Chaucer puts a lot of classical elements in it, including a catalog, right? And so the classical epics included catalogs. It was often thought those were mnemonic devices for the poets, but for whatever reason, Chaucer kind of puts one in and it's a catalog of trees. But what makes it even worse is that the narrator, the knight, keeps saying he's not going to give you a catalog of trees as he then lists a catalog of trees. And so it's just it's almost meta bad, right? So bad it's good. So that's one that's always stuck with me. But then as I mentioned, you teach them and like some of them the badness is just everyone knows it's bad. The physician's tale is just a bad tale. The moral does not cohere in any way. And so I started thinking, okay, well, there's probably a critical mass, but the challenge will be that if I do this, I would need to say, have at least one bad thing for each of the Canterbury tales. And
Hmm.
so the hardest was the Summoner's Tale for me. That was the one, I guess, in my unofficial way of judging things, is probably the best of the Canterbury tales, or at least the least bad, because I had to rack my brain coming up with a reason to include it in the collection.
So why did you include it? What did you come up with?
They're dead children. Okay. And so the Summoner's Tale is one of Chaucer's fabliaux. So it's a very funny tale. It's got quite possibly the best fart joke or tied for the best fart joke with the Miller's Tale in all of English literature. So it's an outrageously funny tale, but the dead children in it do kind of undercut the humor. And so I tried to kind of think about the ways in which the humor wasn't as unified as it might be. But as your only too candid author will be the first to admit, I stretched on that one. But you can't have a book called Bad Chaucer, the great poet's greatest mistakes in the Canterbury Tales, and then say, no, the Summoner's Tale gets a pass. I had to say something.
Yeah, you have to say something when you've thrown down the gauntlet,
Yes,
you got to
exactly.
get
Right.
there.
Throw down the gauntlet, but not all of your strikes will hit or something. I'm probably mixing jousting and karate metaphors or something, but nothing wrong with a mixed metaphor.
Right? But we'll just put it in our book about why your project didn't work.
Right. Yes,
Bad,
exactly.
bad
Yes.
Tyson.
Yes. I would love it if someone wrote that book. Not my, not my husband, he cannot, but anyone else can write that book.
Yeah, that might be a little too personal.
A little too personal. Yes.
So we were talking about Fabio a minute ago, and you really hit on in this book one of the things that really bothered me about The Miller's Tale. And, it's something that maybe is small to other people because The Miller's Tale is so funny in a lot of ways, but it feels like the guy who's the victim is
Hmm.
totally undeserving. And you kind
Yeah.
of wonder, like, why would he be set up to be undeserving of
Yeah.
the fate that he gets? So
Yes.
first, before we get into what's bad about it, can you give us the quickest of rundowns? What happens in The Miller's Tale for people who
Sure.
haven't read it?
Yeah, so The Miller's Tale is one of Chaucer's best comic tales, fabliaux. So you have the old man John, who's married to his young bride Allison, and they have a boarder in their house, Nicholas, who decides he wants to sleep with Allison. Allison also has another potential wannabe boyfriend in Absalom, and comic shenanigans ensue. I think that's the best way to summarize. But Absalom ends up kissing Allison's rear, and Nicholas gets burned in the ass with a hot iron coulter. And John, believing that the flood is coming, this, yes, it is impossible to give a quick plot summary of the
It's so
Miller's
true.
Tale. Yeah. But anyway, dear listener, he is in a tub hanging from the ceiling. He thinks the flood is coming, cuts the rope hanging the tub up down, and falls and breaks his arm. So
Mhm.
he's cuckolded by his wife and breaks his arm. So my point with that chapter is that, as well as the fact that John is perhaps not so deserving of the mistreatment he receives, but also that the narrator just lies about him constantly. The narrator is always saying how jealous he is, how he holds Allison narrow in a cage and is protective, and that he would, kill her or any suitor of her. But it's just not true. I mean,
Mhm.
there's these other parts in the story when Absalom comes serenading Allison in the middle of the night, and his response is not, I'm going to kill that guy, or I'm going to kill you, Allison. It's like, oh, who's that? What's going on? And Allison's just like, oh, never mind. It doesn't matter. He's like, okay, sure. So,
Yeah, he's like, I
yeah,
think it's for you.
yeah, exactly. He's completely misrepresented by the narrator. And so I think we are encouraged to read the story in a way that then makes this punishment fitting. But if we're actually careful readers, it is a little bit unfair. And I will add, though, that the peer reviewer of the book disagreed with me on that. She found John a more odious character because of the age difference. And, this is, I mean, and there is quite a substantial age difference. And this is kind of what we were saying earlier about the context of then versus now, right? And so, context of now of a much older man with a very young woman is predatory and disturbing. But context of Middle Ages, it wasn't. That was fairly common. And we have definitely records of much older men marrying much younger brides, often for political purposes. So I just thought that was interesting because in that moment of my analysis, I was saying, well, no, let's look at this in terms of the 14th century cultural context. And my reviewer was saying, wait, we need to look at it in both. And so I hope that helped me edit the chapter. And so I do kind of look both ways. But I thought that that was a good moment for me as the author of the book to think about how am I juggling? How effectively am I doing this complex juggling that we always need to be doing looking at the Middle Ages?
Yeah, and it's a complex question because if people broadly in the 14th
Mhm.
century thought that May, January
Right.
romances
Yeah.
were a bad thing, and maybe romance should be in quotation marks,
Right.
thought that they were a bad thing societally, then it wouldn't have happened as much, but it was accepted by society. Maybe people
Hmm.
were like, it could be classier, but it was just something that was happening. So, I mean, to me, that wasn't really the issue with John in this story. It was that he was supposed to be jealous, but he wasn't jealous, as you
Wasn't.
say. And
Not at
so, like,
all. Yeah.
what?
Yeah. The
Why
other
should?
part, at the end of the story, when Absalom is going to woo Allison again, and he asks someone, oh, where is John? And the person replies, well, he's either at home or he's out of town. I'm not sure which. And that doesn't slow Absalom down for a second, right? He never confirms, oh, yes, he is out of town. He just goes right ahead. No one's afraid of him.
Mhm.
No one
Yeah.
is worried about his response. So, he gets a broken arm. What I do love about the story is that Allison gets off scot-free, right? Everyone, all of the men suffer and she doesn't. So that's a nice little ending to the story for her.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing too is that poor John is being convinced that it's the end of the world, like it's the
Yes.
flood, and
Yeah.
he believes it, and he's getting ready for it, and he's worried about Allison's fate.
Yes.
He's
That's one of
like,
his first responses. Oh, my dear wife, right? Shall she drown? Yes. Oh, so he's so concerned about her. And that's, again, it makes his relationship with her, I mean, marriage with her, seem less predatory than we might expect, right? That it's not just the sexual attraction. It seems like he actually has feelings for her in lines like that. So
hmm
he's a much more finely drawn character, and I think this is actually could be part of the critique, right? Than he needs to be. He should just be a stock character so that we just laugh at him and laugh at his pain. But Chaucer, I think, humanized him too much. And so that's, I think, a fault in the humor there if you don't quite get the full force of the big comic joke that it is.
Yeah, that's it. I think for me, the discomfort in the Canterbury Tales is that he's so good at making you feel for these people that many times that medieval sense of humor that tends to be quite cruel comes
Yes.
through in a way that hits me wrong, you know?
Yes.
So this is I thought a perfect example. So as I'm reading your book, I'm going, yeah, this is it. This is what I couldn't articulate in class way back in the day.
Oh, good. Good, good, good. Well, hopefully this will help.
Now, one of the stories that you pulled out, and I thought was, well, I mean, you've pulled out all the tales, but one of the ones that you pulled out that I thought you analyzed really well as well was the tale of patient Griselda. So this is the clerk's
Oh,
tale, I think, right? And this one
yeah.
is supposed to be straightforwardly moralizing, and yet it's not.
It is just not, right? And I mean, Chaucer often had what gymnasts have problems sticking the landing.
Yeah.
Chaucer has problems sticking the moral. And there's just no moral or thematic consistency for the tale. And it just collapses at the end. And, we have these polyphony of voices at the end trying to give it meaning, and it just adds to the confusion. And so with the Clerk's Tale, I actually was just teaching it yesterday, and I knew my students would hate it. And I encouraged them to hate it. That's fine. Give me a passionate reaction over a meh reaction any day. And I said, I hate the tale too, but I find it fascinating, right? And so that's what I'm trying to do with my class, and I hope I do with the chapter a little bit. It is just so painful to read. It is the cruelest story imaginable of the husband, Walter, testing his wife, Patience, by convincing her their children have been murdered, executed on his command. And her response, right? The readers want her to stand up and speak for herself, but she is patient Griselda. She just accepts all that her husband throws at her. And it's, emotionally wrenching to read the story. And then we get to the supposedly happy ending, and where Walter's like, just kidding.
Yeah.
Here are your kids, they're alive, and yeah, we're still married, and it's all good. And we as readers, I think, are meant to be swept along with it. But one of the things that first my first reactions to the story was it's the children who are there too, who are learning that their father convinced their mother they were dead for all these years. It's like, how can you have a happily family reunion when learning that your father told your mother that you were dead for your entire life? And so
Hmm.
we're just kind of swept into this, but it's a very troubling tale. But it's inspired not just by, medieval tales, stories. I think Boccaccio tells it as well. But it's also an allegory of the Book of Job, which is an equally troubling story for, many people today. Many people of deep faith have struggled with the story of Job because God makes a gamble with Satan, makes a bet with Satan about whether Job will renounce him if he suffers enough. And it's just hard to think of a loving God inflicting that much suffering on poor Job, as is very hard to witness as a reader. Walter, who is ultimately a good guy, I guess, by the end of the story, right? Putting his wife through test after test after test. So, yeah, it's a horrible story. But again, I read it with my eyes popping out of my head every time. It's like, oh, no, he didn't. But yes, he did.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic in the Middle Ages. Chaucer's not the first person to come across or to present a story of patient Griselda, I don't think, unless
Right.
I've totally lost my mind here. But yeah, it is a very strange way that he presents it, in that he's like, women are capable of suffering a lot, and
Yes.
that's
More
great,
than men, he says. They're capable of suffering more than men. Yeah.
more than men. But you shouldn't, but you also should.
Yes, exactly. Right. And so where's the moral, right? What are we supposed to learn from this if you should, but you shouldn't? And obviously, what we just saw was that Griselda should,
Hmm.
right? Because she is rewarded at the end. And so when the narrator is saying you should, but you shouldn't, but your character did, any kind of thematic consistency just collapses in on itself. It's like a black hole of meaning at the end of the story.
Which is exactly what you want. And like rehashing something as spiritual as the book
Yeah.
of Job, you want it to be a
Yeah.
black hole at the end.
Yep. I mean, that's often a sign of great literature, right? An ambiguous ending, but some stories take it a little too far. Ambiguity, sure. Black hole, no. Maybe that will be the dividing line.
Yeah, and because there are so many people that work very hard to make this mean something definite, and it
Yeah.
just resists and resists and resists. It's very hard to pin this one down.
Yeah. Again, I think that's, one of the problems with the scholarly project writ large is that you want to have a thesis, you want to prove it in your reading of the tale. So you want to tie it up with a nice little bow, but some of these stories really resist that nice little bow. And so when a scholar is saying, this is the meaning of the story, it's often a little forced.
Yeah.
So bad Chaucer alleviates us of the necessity for the little bows.
That's right. But I suppose the scholars have to finish their book somehow, right? So
Yeah,
they're like, we
yeah,
we need to finish this. Let's
yeah,
just
yeah.
let's make it work.
Yeah, yeah. And the best way to do it is like Chaucer did it, right? I'm sorry. I take it all back. And I certainly copied that move in Bad Chaucer too, right? Because, as much as the title is Bad Chaucer, I hope it's apparent to the people who read it that I could only write Bad Chaucer if I thought there was so much good in Chaucer too. So
Hmm.
I enjoy reading him. It gives me great pleasure to read and teach his literature. That doesn't mean we have to venerate him. We can have the good
Yes.
and the bad.
Yes. Well, speaking of veneration, we need to talk about the wife of Bath's Tale because this is the one that people talk about the most. So, this is a character that a lot of people will say is like proto-feminist. She is learned in a lot of ways that are unexpected. She's putting forth ideas that, are not super popular among medieval writers. So, how is she different to you in the way that Chaucer is writing her?
Well, I think she's such a great character because she just has this unique voice, right? When she starts speaking in the Canterbury Tales, you can almost hear the roar, right? That she is tired of the patriarchy of the Middle Ages telling women what to do. Very importantly, she is a widow in the Middle Ages, and roughly speaking, women in the Middle Ages were daughters first, and that's controlled by their fathers, and then wives, and that's controlled by their husbands. But widows had a range of motion and freedom that most women, other women of the time, did not have. And we just see her as this voice of her own freedom. And she says immediately that I'm going to speak about my experience and I don't care what the authorities have to say. And those words are just groundbreaking and revolutionary because who are the authorities she's speaking to? They're the men.
Hmm.
And she's saying that I have my experience as a woman is equivalent to that, and it should give me equal authority to speak. And then she throws the additional curveball in that she knows the male authorities backwards and forwards as well as the men themselves do. So she's such a great character, but then in the same time, she remains a character kind of enamored by the traditions that we might think that she would herself escape from. And so she ends up telling this romance story about a rapist knight who is redeemed by the end of the story. And the end is quite complex. The end of the tale kind of ends up with a happily ever after ending of the rapist knight is now reformed and he's married to this beautiful woman who will love him and be faithful to him. And so her story ends at that moment, but she does end it then. She returns to the voice of her prologue by cursing her audience, which is a very interesting way to end the tale with a curse. I always, in class, I always think about, can anyone name another story that ends with a curse? Wouldn't Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice be very different? And it ended with a damning of the of the readers or the other characters in the story. But at the same time, we have to see the wife of Bath as kind of constructed by male discourse ultimately. And so Chaucer is the one who both paints her and constrains her at the same time. And one of the most poignant moments, or maybe not poignant, but astute moments, poignant and astute perhaps, is when the wife of Bath says, "Who painted the lion? Tell me who." And she's referring to an old legend of a lion sees a painting of a lion defeated by a human in a battle. And the lion says, "Yeah, but who painted this lion?" Referring to the fact that if the lion had done the painting, right, it would look completely different. And so the wife of Bath cites that example, cites that fable, but then at the same time, she's not a person, right?
Mhm.
She remains a fictional character, ultimately being painted by the same kind of patriarchal discourses that she's resisting. It's almost like a net that the character can't free itself of because the character is drawn by the net as well.
Yeah, yeah. Although I had to stop and think about that for a second because that's not where I expected your sentence to end, but it's so correct, though. And I think about it, I tend to think about characters that are written by men that are part of like a big discussion about how can we write other people that are not
Mhm.
us. But when it comes to characters like this one, it really sort of begs the question, like, can any of us ever escape the culture that we have grown up
Right.
in,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we can't, right? I mean, what would that mean? A reboot of the brain or something like that? I mean, we can't really escape that. And so how authors deal with that is one of the great challenges of being an author. And, we can see moments where authors succeed and where they get a little tripped up or don't quite see their vision all the way through. I think that's a good way to think about the Wife of Bath, that Chaucer had a great vision, but there's just these little places where he is painting the character, and maybe the wife of Bath is looking. It's fun to think of, again, a metatextual moment of the wife of Bath reading her story and being like, it's good. That's not quite right, though. Calling Chaucer in for a few more edits, right?
Yeah, I think her
Yeah.
edits might be never ending.
Yes, yes, could well be that too.
So, as somebody who notices the fact that Chaucer can paint these characters so three-dimensionally, when we look at the wife of Bath and she has these perspectives on her situation as a woman in the 14th century, and he takes the time to really build this out, how do you feel like that reflects on the other characters who become flat or not fleshed out? I'm talking about like all the women characters who you mentioned in the book who become faceless or nameless or victims and they don't have that three dimensionality. How does this speak to you when you're looking at Chaucer? You can see he's got the potential for it, but he doesn't bother in other places. Is that something that bothers you or something that you think about when you're teaching it?
Yeah, again, it's just the complexity of drawing characters, right? And so, and again, that shifts genre by genre. And so, what we were saying earlier about the Miller's Tale, and that it was a problem that he made John a better rounded character or a light about character, and just keeping the character simpler would have been helpful, right? And I think that works in Fabliaux, where Fabliaux are like medieval cartoons. The humor is very broad and funny and drawn with thick lines to extend the cartooning metaphor. And not every character can be or should be drawn out fully, right? A story would never end if all the supporting characters had rich backstories. And just on a side note, I think that's driving me crazy about a lot of modern television series where they're like, every character has to have a backstory where we go back, 20 years into their past and learn about what's motivating them now. It's like, no, we could just concentrate on the storyline. But, the flip side of that is what you're pointing out is that some characters do require, and we as readers would benefit for a bit more attention to them and their experiences of the events as well. Yeah, it's interesting to think through the Canterbury Tales and who would you like to hear more from? I mean, one example that just pops to mind is in The Knight's Tale, it's Emily. So the knights Palamon and Arcita are fighting over their love for her, and her response is giving very little attention in the story.
Mm-hmm.
She prays to Diana that, hey, I prefer not to have either. And so what we know most about her is that she wants not to be a part of this story. But she can't write herself out of the story that she's been written into. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's a great moment to think about where Chaucer could have given us more. That was not the focus of his story, I think would be a fair rebuttal. But that's then very telling that that wasn't the focus of his story. And that's why I think so many writers are returning to older stories and thinking about the perspectives of the female characters or the queer characters who aren't in it at all and thinking about how they would have navigated those circumstances. So literature continues to be a conversation, and we need authors today to look back at the Canterbury Tales and rewrite them. Think about who we're missing, and some are doing that
Yeah.
in really wonderful ways.
Well, you mentioned about possibly adding more to a character like Emily. And my question as somebody who has had to edit my own books, and make things smooth and make them work is why not take it out? Why is that in there at all? Why wouldn't you just take it out? And so is that more meaningful? Do we need to put more weight on that? Like, what does
Uh-huh.
it mean?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Take her out entirely and give her her own story.
Hmm.
Or what could be equally interesting or differently interesting is taking her out of the Knight's Tale, and then what do you have? Because she's more a plot catalyst than a character, I would say, right? Again, thinking about who gets to, be elevated to the status of a character. She's what gets the plot in motion. And just as we were saying, right, her needs, her desires are overlooked in the grand sweep of the epic tale that's before her. And she gets to her happily ever after ending that she didn't want, that she specifically, requested not be granted to her. So how happy are we supposed to take this ending?
Yeah, yeah. And if I am to bring back Shakespeare again, like when this happens in Shakespeare, we call this a problem play,
Right,
like,
right.
and it's
Yeah,
interesting thinking about that. We don't look back at Chaucer and say, this is a problem, or people
yeah,
didn't until
yeah,
now.
yeah. No, but that would have been a great title. Sorry. Sorry we're having this conversation after the book came out. But yeah, Chaucer's Problem Tales. Oh well, bad Chaucer. I'm stuck with it.
No, I love it. I love it.
Okay,
It
yeah.
encapsulates everything in just two words. So as we wrap up, when you were creating Bad Chaucer, and I think that you've already gotten to this already, what were you trying to achieve with the book? You think we should just look at Chaucer? You think we should look at everything with these eyes and actually say the emperor has no clothes?
I hope it does a couple of things. I mean, all authors, I hope it's read. I hope scholars read it. I hope that they find it helpful to kind of, rethink some aspects of the Canterbury Tales. I would love it if students and general readers read it too, because in some ways, I hope the book can just affirm people in their criticism of Chaucer, right? That we don't have to be, kind of ensnared in hero worship. I also wanted to do it I wanted it to be, dare I say, please don't laugh, but to show that scholarship can be fun and
Yeah.
light and still, I hope, make a contribution. Scholarship should be rigorous and it should be challenging, but I think we need to, at the same time, have a space in our work for different ways of thinking and talking about text, because so often the language of the academy is just so alienated. So I hope that Bad Chaucer as a title can bring people into Chaucer in a way that I include my own, earlier works likely wouldn't have. So as much as I stand by those scholarly tomes, right, I know they are not bestsellers by any means, nor will Bad Chaucer be, but I hope it does reach at least a slightly larger audience and will kind of shine a different light that Chaucer is not work, Chaucer is pleasure. That even if you signed up for him in a class because you had to have that pre-17th century requirement, and this is the only one that fits your schedule, this could be a great class that you find yourself in.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's so important. Something that you're doing with the project is allowing for people to just come to that. And again, this is something that I was talking about with Usha, we're talking about medievalism, allowing people to come to things that are old and not allowing those
Yes,
things to be fossilized, right?
yes,
Everyone's
yes,
interpretation is valid.
yes. I mean, all of human history is worth remembering. We don't want to just throw things out and the ever forward rush to presentism. And so it's good to look back at the same time. And we're not always going to like what we see. We're going to see good with bad, but I think it's important to keep looking.
Yeah, allowing these things to exist at the same time, the good Chaucer, the bad
Yes.
Chaucer, all of
Yes.
it at the same time. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about bad Chaucer and also good Chaucer and all of the things Canterbury Tales. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
To find out more about Tison's work, you can visit his faculty page at the University of Central Florida. His new book is Bad Chaucer, the great poet's greatest mistakes in the Canterbury Tales. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey, hey. So the British Library has opened its big new exhibition, right, on medieval women in their own words.
I know, it's so exciting.
Yeah, it's like 140 items. One with incredible piece, there's a letter by Joan of Arc.
Nice.
They have that. They have a whole bunch of events. It seems a really good thing for medievalists to go check out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, everyone to go check out, but especially medievalists. I mean, I wish I was there checking it out right now.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, like how much we kind of miss out by not being in London enough,
Yeah.
being a little too far from the UK for all this medieval goodness.
Yes. But someday we will be back again. We will be digging into more treasures.
So we have news about that. Plus, I have this story about this 10th century geographer. His name was Al-Makdisi. He was a Palestinian, and he was the first person to look at geography as a science.
Ooh.
But he decided to do it. He had to explore all these places himself, right? So he talks about his life of travels, and he seems to have had an amazing life. He can just writes at one point, I've eaten porridge with mystics, supped broth with monks, and pudding with sailors. I've been ejected from mosques at night, have traveled in the solitudes, gone astray in the deserts. A number of times I was close to drowning. Our caverns were waylaid in the highway. I have served the judges and the great ones, have spoken with rulers and ministers. I have accompanied the licentious on the way, sold goods in the market, been confined in a jail, been accused as a spy.
Wow. That's really selling it right there. That's a biography that I want to read.
Yes. And that's just the start of his work.
Nice.
So we talk a bit about his life and times. So we have that, plus we have a piece on the actual medieval kingdom of Afghanistan and about a Norman conquest coin hoard that just sold at auction for 4.3 million pounds.
Wow. That would be a lot of flights for us to get to the UK, right?
Indeed. Yeah, if we go to UK, we go metal hunting, metal detecting, right?
I know. It's your dream. It's your dream.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you out there whose kind generosity makes my work possible. Whether you're letting the ads play through, telling your friends about my books and podcasts, proudly wearing a 5-Minute Medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or becoming a patron at patreon.com, your support is greatly appreciated. Patronage is the biggest part of how I pay the bills, so if you love this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon community to help a girl out and keep the medieval content going. You can find out how at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from literature to caricature, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.